My name is Lucas Wilson, and for years I believed I had built the perfect life. Fire and Steel, my restaurant, was my pride and joy, something I had created from nothing, turning it into one of the most respected dining spots in New York. I had a wife, Catherine, who had been by my side since the early days, and a business partner, Eric, who I trusted like a brother. I thought we were building something great together. I thought we were a team, but I was wrong. It started with small things. Catherine growing distant, Eric avoiding my eyes, late nights that couldn't be explained, hushed conversations that stopped when I entered the room. And then I found the truth. Proof that the two people I trusted most weren't just betraying me behind my back. They were planning to take everything from me. My business, my success, my future. They thought I wouldn't see it coming. They thought they could play me for a fool. But they underestimated me, and by the time I was done, they would regret ever thinking they could take me down. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. If you enjoyed this one, leave a like, it really helps. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Let's discuss. Lucas Wilson had built Fire and Steel from nothing. What started as a small, struggling bistro had turned into one of the most sought-after dining experiences in New York City. His restaurant wasn't just a business, it was his life's work, his pride. Every inch of it carried his blood, sweat, and sacrifices. He had spent years perfecting the ambiance, the menu, and the reputation, and through it all, his wife, Catherine, had been by his side. At least, that's what he had believed. They had been married for 7 years. Catherine was beautiful, sophisticated, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who always knew how to be in the right place at the right time. She had been with Lucas since the early days, when he was just a chef with a dream. She had seen his late nights, his failures, his desperate attempts to keep the restaurant afloat when no one believed in him, and when success finally came, she reaped the benefits alongside him. It had always been their victory, or so he thought. Lately, things felt different. Catherine had grown distant. She was still there, still the perfect wife in public, still smiling for the cameras when Fire and Steel got featured in a magazine, but something in her eyes had changed. Lucas had always prided himself on being a man of instincts. It was what made him a great chef. He knew when a steak was perfectly cooked just by the sound of the sear. And now his instincts were screaming at him that something was off. It wasn't just Catherine. Eric Hudson, his best friend and business partner, had started acting strange as well. They had known each other since culinary school, started the restaurant together, and built everything side by side. Eric had always been the charming one, the one who could talk to investors and make deals while Lucas focused on the food. But lately, Eric had been avoiding him. There were hushed conversations that stopped when Lucas entered the room, text messages that Eric quickly tucked his phone away from. The worst part? The way Catherine and Eric exchanged glances when they thought he wasn't looking. Lucas tried to shake the feeling, tried to tell himself he was overthinking it. Stress did that to people. Maybe Catherine was just bored, maybe Eric was just handling business. But then came the night that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening, and the restaurant was buzzing. Fire and Steel had a private event, a high-profile engagement party for the son of a tech mogul. It was the kind of event that cemented Fire and Steel as an elite establishment. Lucas should have been in the kitchen, overseeing the dishes, but instead he was in his office, reviewing the latest financial reports. Something wasn't right. The numbers didn't add up. Lucas had a near photographic memory when it came to his restaurant's finances. Every supplier, every invoice, every paycheck. He knew it all. But tonight, something was off. There were discrepancies in the last 3 months of reports. Money had been moved around, invoices altered. Someone had been skimming off the top. Not a huge amount, nothing obvious, but enough for Lucas to notice. He double-checked, triple-checked. The patterns were subtle, but they were there, and every single suspicious transaction led back to one person, Eric. Lucas leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He wasn't a fool. If Eric was stealing, there had to be a reason. And given the way Catherine had been acting, the sickening thought crept into his mind. What if they were in on this together? He tried to tell himself it was impossible. Catherine loved him. Eric was his brother in everything but blood, but the numbers told a different story. And Lucas had learned long ago that numbers didn't lie. The thought gnawed at him all evening. He went through the motions, greeting guests, making sure the kitchen was running smoothly, but his mind was elsewhere. Then, just as the night was winding down, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Catherine and Eric, standing too close in the dimly lit corridor near the wine cellar, their bodies almost touching, her hand grazing his wrist. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way Catherine looked up at Eric, the way he leaned in just slightly toward her, it was enough. Lucas had seen that look before. He had seen it in the early days when Catherine had looked at him like he was the only man in the world. His stomach twisted. He wanted to storm over, demand answers, but he forced himself to stay put. If they were betraying him, if they were lying to his face, then he wasn't going to confront them like some scorned fool. No. He would be patient. He would be smart. That night, long after Catherine had fallen asleep beside him, Lucas lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the truth pressed down on him, suffocating. The restaurant, his business, his marriage, everything he had built was under threat. And if Catherine and Eric thought they could take it from him, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Lucas didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, he did what any good chef would do. He prepped. He gathered ingredients, sharpened his knives, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. If Catherine and Eric thought they could play him for a fool, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The first step was confirmation. Suspicion wasn't enough. He needed evidence, undeniable proof that would expose their betrayal and give him the upper hand. Over the next few days, he became an observer in his own life. He paid attention to Catherine's habits, the way she clutched her phone a little tighter, the way she slipped out to take calls she didn't want him to hear. She had always been affectionate, but now every touch felt calculated, every kiss a little too forced. Then there was Eric, his best friend, his partner, the man he had trusted more than anyone. Lucas watched as Eric avoided eye contact, how he started leaving work early but never mentioned where he was going. He checked the restaurant's security footage and saw Catherine slipping into Eric's office late at night. No one else around. Lucas needed more. He hired a private investigator, someone discreet. If there was something to find, he wanted it documented. The PI wasted no time. Within days, Lucas had photos. Catherine and Eric meeting at a hotel, checking in separately but leaving together hours later. An expensive dinner paid for with the restaurant's corporate card. Late-night meetings that had nothing to do with business. Lucas stared at the pictures in his hands, feeling a strange sense of detachment. He thought he would explode with rage, that he would throw things, scream, demand answers, but instead, he felt cold, empty. The woman he had loved, the man he had trusted, had conspired against him. Not just in his marriage, but in his business. It was worse than he thought. The investigator had dug deeper, finding more than just an affair. Eric had been siphoning money from the restaurant, rerouting funds through a fake supplier account. Catherine had been helping him cover the tracks. Their endgame? A hostile takeover. They had been planning to force Lucas out, frame him for financial misconduct, and seize control of fire and steel. Lucas had spent his life perfecting his craft, creating something from nothing. And now they were trying to steal it from him. He wasn't just betrayed, he was being hunted in his own empire. But they had underestimated him. He didn't confront Catherine that night. He acted normal, kissed her on the cheek, asked about her day. He played the part of the oblivious husband, the trusting fool. Let her think she was winning. Let her get comfortable. At the restaurant, he was just as careful. He joked with Eric like nothing was wrong, listened to his fake excuses, pretended not to notice the tension behind his smile. Lucas knew that if he lashed out too soon, if he let them see the storm brewing inside him, they would run. And he wasn't ready for them to run. Not yet. Instead, he planned. He went through every document in the restaurant's accounts, tracing Eric's fraudulent transactions. He collected financial records, cross-checked suppliers, and gathered hard proof of the theft. He called his lawyer, laying the groundwork for legal action. He reached out to trusted investors, planting seeds of doubt about Eric's reliability. He set traps. Lucas let slip to Catherine that he was thinking of taking a break from the restaurant. maybe stepping away for a while to clear his head. He watched as her expression flickered with something close to relief before she caught herself. He could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. If Lucas stepped away, if he willingly loosened his grip, it would make their takeover so much easier. Eric took the bait as well. "That might be good for you, man," he said, feigning concern. "You've been working non-stop for years. Maybe it's time you let someone else handle things for a bit." Lucas nodded, pretending to consider it. "Maybe. I'll think about it." That night, he went home and made dinner for Catherine. He poured her wine, listened to her talk, acted like the devoted husband, and when she fell asleep, he sat in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, replaying every lie she had ever told him. Soon, the game would end, and when it did, he would make sure they lost everything. Lucas knew that patience was his greatest weapon. He had all the proof he needed, but proof alone wasn't enough. If he exposed them now, they would scramble, try to cover their tracks, maybe even find a way to pin some of the blame on him. No, he needed to make sure that when he struck, there would be no escape, no way for them to rebuild. They had tried to burn down everything he built, so he would return the favor. The first step was controlling the restaurant's financial structure. Eric had been siphoning money through a fake supplier, but Lucas had spent the last week quietly rerouting accounts, shifting control of Fire and Steel's assets entirely into his name. It took a few strategic moves, a few favors called in, but by the end of it, the restaurant belonged to him alone. Eric might think he was still in control, still playing Lucas like a fool, but in reality, every step he took was leading him into a trap. Lucas also had to ensure that the fallout would be absolute. He planted information in the right places, tipped off the restaurant's investors about concerns regarding Eric's mismanagement. He made sure to mention it in passing, as if he were just voicing casual worries. But casual worries among high-stakes investors could spread like wildfire. If they began to suspect fraud, they wouldn't just pull their funding, they would demand audits, lawyers, investigations. And when that happened, Eric wouldn't just lose Fire and Steel, he would lose his entire career. Catherine was easier to manipulate. She was smart, but not careful. She assumed Lucas was still blind, still clueless, and that made her reckless. She started being bolder, more obvious. She would come home late, her excuses becoming lazier. When he asked why she smelled like whiskey, she didn't even try to lie convincingly. "Just drinks with some friends," she would say with a shrug, barely looking up from her phone. Lucas played his part well. He made sure to look just distracted enough, just distant enough, that she believed she had already won. He could see it in her eyes. She thought he was breaking. She thought that any day now he would finally give up, finally walk away and leave everything in her and Eric's hands. She had no idea how wrong she was. The real trap was the upcoming investor dinner. It was an annual event, a showcase for Fire and Steel's biggest backers. Normally, Lucas handled everything. He was the face of the restaurant, the man who made investors feel confident about their money, but this time, he let Eric take the lead. "I trust you, man," he told him, clapping him on the shoulder. "You've been handling so much, I think it's time you got the recognition for it." Eric had taken the bait instantly, puffing up with pride, already imagining himself as the new king of Fire and Steel. He thought it was a sign of Lucas stepping back, a sign that his plan was working. He had no idea that Lucas had already set everything in motion. The night before the event, Lucas made one final move. He had the private investigator compile all the evidence, the stolen money, the fraud, the affair, and package it neatly into a digital file. And then he made sure that every single investor would have access to it. A scheduled email set to be sent out at exactly 9 p.m. the next evening, right in the middle of Eric's speech. By the time Eric would be standing in front of the room, proudly presenting himself as the future of Fire and Steel, every investor in the room would be receiving proof that he was nothing more than a fraud and a thief. And when they turned on him, when they demanded answers, demanded accountability, Lucas would be waiting. Catherine, too, had a surprise waiting for her. Lucas had been careful, playing the long game, making sure that when she fell hard. He had already spoken with a divorce attorney, already put plans in place to ensure that she walked away with nothing. He had even managed to have her name quietly removed from their shared assets. The stage was set, the pieces were in place, all that was left was to watch it all come crashing down. The investor dinner was held at one of the city's most exclusive venues, a rooftop restaurant overlooking the skyline. It was the kind of event where money talked, where reputations were built or destroyed over a single glass of wine. Lucas arrived early, dressed in a sharp navy suit, playing his part flawlessly. He smiled, shook hands, exchanged pleasantries with investors who had trusted him for years. They all assumed he was here to show support for Eric, to step aside gracefully and let his partner take over the spotlight. They had no idea what was about to happen. Eric arrived fashionably late, as always, dressed in a custom-tailored tux, the picture of confidence. He moved through the room with ease, working the crowd, laughing too loudly, slapping backs, making promises he had no right to make. He acted like he had already won. Lucas watched from the bar, sipping his whiskey, letting the moment stretch, letting Eric dig himself deeper with every handshake, every boastful remark. Catherine was there too, standing just behind Eric, playing the devoted wife of the soon-to-be new restaurant mogul. She looked stunning in a black dress, her makeup flawless, her smile radiant. Lucas used to love that smile. Now it made him sick. The dinner began, the guests taking their seats as the servers moved through the room, refilling glasses, setting down perfectly plated courses. Lucas remained silent, waiting for the perfect moment. And then it came. Eric stood up, tapping his glass for attention, flashing that smug grin that Lucas had once trusted. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eric began, his voice smooth, practiced. "It's an honor to have all of you here tonight. Fire and Steel has been more than a restaurant. It's been a vision, a passion, and I am thrilled to share that we are about to embark on a bold new chapter." Lucas glanced at his watch, 8:59 p.m. As many of you know, we've been exploring opportunities for expansion, and after months of careful planning, I'm proud to announce that Fire and Steel is securing a multi-million-dollar investment that will take us to the next level. New locations, a brand overhaul, a future where... 9:00 p.m. A ripple passed through the room. Phones buzzed, screens lit up, whispers spread like wildfire. Investors glanced at their devices, brows furrowing, expressions shifting from polite interest to confusion, then to shock. Some turned to their neighbors, showing screens filled with emails, attachments, evidence. Eric faltered. He noticed the shift, the uneasy glances, the way people stopped listening to him and started murmuring to each other. Lucas leaned back in his chair, taking in the moment. "What the hell is this?" One of the investors, a man in his 60s with a deep voice and a sharp gaze, held up his phone. "Eric, is this a joke?" Eric blinked. What?" Another voice cut through. "These are bank statements, fraudulent transactions." A woman's voice now, sharp with anger. "Money rerouted from Fire and Steel's accounts to a shell company?" "Eric, explain this." Eric's face drained of color. He glanced at Catherine, but she was frozen in place, gripping her wine glass too tightly. Lucas stood up, slowly adjusting his cuffs. "I'd like to hear the explanation myself," he said, his voice calm, steady. "Eric, Catherine, maybe you'd like to share with the room what exactly you've been doing behind my back." Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Eric opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked around the room, desperate for an escape, but there was none. Every person in this room had just received undeniable proof that he was a fraud. The very people he had hoped to impress were now staring at him like he was dirt beneath their shoes. Lucas took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Eric and Catherine could hear. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" he said. "Did you think you were smarter than me?" Eric swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "Lucas, we can talk about this." "No," Lucas cut him off. "We're past talking." Catherine finally snapped out of her daze. She turned to Lucas, eyes wild, lips parted in panic. "Lucas, please, you have to understand." "I understand perfectly," he said coldly. "I understand that the two of you weren't just content with betraying me. You wanted to take everything from me, my business, my money, my life's work." He let the words sink in. "But you made one crucial mistake." Eric shook his head, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "Look, we can fix this. We can come to an agreement." Lucas let out a short, humorless laugh. "An agreement? You think I'd negotiate with you after what you've done?" He tilted his head slightly. "No, Eric. The only thing left for you to do is watch as everything you built your little scheme on crumbles." The investors were already making their decisions. One by one, they pushed back their chairs, shaking their heads in disgust. Some were already on their phones, talking to their legal teams. The weight of Eric's downfall was setting in. And Lucas, he wasn't done yet. Lucas let the weight of the moment sink in. The investor dinner, which had started as a carefully orchestrated showcase of Fire and Steel's future, had turned into a tribunal. The people in this room weren't just wealthy backers, they were power brokers, the kind of individuals who could make or break someone with a single phone call. And right now, every one of them was staring at Eric like he was a stain on the bottom of their shoes. Eric stood there, his confidence evaporating by the second. His fingers twitched at his sides, his breath coming faster as he glanced around, searching for a sympathetic face. There were none. The men and women who had once clinked glasses with him, who had nodded along to his grand ideas about expansion and legacy, were now looking at him with barely concealed disgust. One of the older investors, a man named Charles Davenport, cleared his throat and adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses. "Eric," he said, his voice heavy with disapproval, "I'd like to hear an explanation. Right now?" Eric swallowed hard. This isn't what it looks like," he stammered. "I can explain everything." Lucas crossed his arms, allowing himself the luxury of watching Eric squirm. "Go ahead, then," he said, his tone deceptively patient. "Explain how you funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars through fake suppliers. Explain how you planned to force me out of my own company. Explain how you lied to every person in this room." Eric opened his mouth, then closed it again. Another investor, a woman in her 50s with a sharp bob and an even sharper tongue, leaned forward. "We trusted you," she said. "You assured us that Fire and Steel was financially stable, that everything was in order. And now we find out that you've been embezzling funds?" "It wasn't like that," Eric tried, his voice shaking now. "I wasn't—" "Save it," Davenport cut him off. "Your name is attached to every one of these fraudulent transactions. There is no misunderstanding here. Either you admit what you've done, or we'll let the authorities sort it out for you." At the mention of authorities, Eric visibly paled. Lucas took a slow step forward, his voice low but razor sharp. "You know what the worst part is, Eric," he said. "It's not just the money. It's not even the betrayal. It's that you actually thought you could outplay me." Eric clenched his jaw, but Lucas could see the cracks forming. The arrogance, the bravado. It was all peeling away, layer by layer, until all that was left was a man who had overplayed his hand. "Lucas," Eric tried again, his tone shifting to something almost pleading, We can work this out. You don't want to do this. There's still a way to fix this." Lucas tilted his head, pretending to consider it. Then he smiled, slow and deliberate. "No, Eric," he said. "There isn't." At that moment, the security guards Lucas had arranged beforehand stepped forward. Their presence was calm but imposing, the kind of men who didn't need to raise their voices to command attention. One of them, a broad-shouldered man in a black suit, addressed Lucas directly. "Would you like us to escort Mr. Hudson out, sir?" Eric's head snapped toward Lucas, his eyes wide. "You're kicking me out? You can't do that!" Lucas raised an eyebrow. "I can, and I am." Panic flickered across Eric's face. He took a half step back, glancing toward Catherine, as if expecting her to step in to defend him. She didn't. She was still sitting at the table, frozen, gripping the stem of her wine glass as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her face was unreadable, but Lucas knew her well enough to see what was happening behind her carefully controlled expression. She was calculating. weighing her options. And then, slowly, she turned her gaze to Lucas. "Lucas," she said, her voice soft, careful, I didn't know it would go this far." Lucas let out a quiet laugh. "You didn't know?" he echoed. "You were helping him, covering for him, sleeping with him." A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the investors hadn't known about that part of the betrayal, now they did. Catherine swallowed. "I made a mistake," she said, shifting in her seat. "No," Lucas interrupted, his voice steady. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. A mistake is ordering the wrong wine for dinner. What you did, that was a choice, over and over again, and now you have to live with the consequences." Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally. She found none. Even the people she had charmed over the years, the investors who had once complimented her poise and intelligence, were now watching her with thinly veiled judgment. Eric, meanwhile, had lost whatever composure he had left. He was still struggling, still fighting against the inevitable. "Lucas, please," he tried again, his voice cracking. "We can work something out. You don't have to do this." Lucas met his gaze, and for the first time, there was nothing but cold finality in his eyes. "Get him out of here," he said. The guards moved in. Eric thrashed once, then realized it was pointless. They gripped his arms, leading him toward the exit as he muttered curses under his breath. The last thing Lucas heard before the doors shut behind him was Eric's voice, hoarse and bitter. "You'll regret this, Luke." Lucas exhaled slowly, the weight of months of deception, anger, and betrayal finally lifting from his chest, but he wasn't done yet. He turned back to Catherine. She was still sitting there, still gripping her glass, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Lucas took a step forward, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "I already filed for divorce," he told her. "You'll be served in the morning. You won't get a cent from me. No money, no assets, no restaurant, nothing." Her breath hitched. "You can't do that." Lucas smiled. "I already have." Her face crumpled, but he didn't feel even a sliver of sympathy. She had played the role of the perfect wife for years, but it had all been a performance. And now, the curtain had fallen. Lucas turned away from her, his parting words quiet but final. "Enjoy the life you chose." And with that, he walked out, leaving her behind in the wreckage of her own making. The night air was crisp as Lucas stepped out of the venue, inhaling deeply, letting the tension of the evening roll off his shoulders. The streets of New York stretched before him, alive with movement, with people who had no idea that just moments ago, a man had been destroyed inside that room. He exhaled slowly, loosening his tie as he walked to his car, feeling lighter than he had in months. It was over. For the first time in weeks, he drove without thinking, letting the city guide him. He wasn't sure where he was going, only that he didn't want to go back to the house he had shared with Catherine. That place wasn't home anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Instead, he found himself pulling into the driveway of an upscale hotel, one he had often recommended to out-of-town investors. The concierge greeted him by name, assuming he was there for business, and within minutes he was checked into a suite overlooking the city. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring out the window at the skyline. Below him, people moved through their lives, oblivious to what had just happened, to the war that had been fought and won tonight. He should have felt triumphant. He had executed his plan perfectly. Eric was finished, Catherine was ruined, and Fire and Steel was entirely his again. But there was no rush of joy, no euphoria, just a deep, quiet satisfaction and a strange sense of emptiness. The first call came at 6 a.m. He didn't answer. By 7, his phone had buzzed with 3 missed calls and a handful of texts, all from Catherine. He let them sit unread, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the hotel's espresso machine as he watched the sun rise over the city. By 8, the texts changed. The first few had been desperate pleas. "Lucas, please, we need to talk. I didn't mean for this to happen." Then, when he didn't respond, they became apologies. "I know I hurt you. I made a mistake. Please, let's fix this." By 9, the anger started. "You had no right to do this. You're punishing me for something you knew was broken a long time ago." By 10, she had shifted to blame. "You pushed me away. You buried yourself in that restaurant. If you had just paid attention to me, none of this would have happened." Lucas read them all, then deleted them without replying. The calls from Eric never came. He wasn't stupid enough to think he could talk his way out of this, not after what had happened in that room. But Lucas didn't need to hear his voice to know exactly what was unfolding for him. By noon, the legal notices had been filed. Lawsuits, official investigations, financial audits. Lucas had made sure the weight of every crime Eric had committed landed squarely on his shoulders. By the time the sun set that evening, the damage would be irreversible. It didn't take long for the news to spread. The restaurant industry was small in the ways that mattered, and the moment whispers of Eric's downfall began, they spread like wildfire. The investors who had once courted him were now avoiding his calls. The high-end suppliers who had once been eager to work with Fire and Steel now wanted nothing to do with him. The restaurant community in New York was brutal. A bad reputation could end a career faster than an empty dining room. Eric had spent years building himself up as Lucas's equal, convincing people that he was just as much the genius behind Fire and Steel's success. Now, those same people were distancing themselves from him, cutting ties before they got pulled into his wreckage. Lucas knew exactly what would happen next. Eric would scramble. He would try to find allies, people who would believe his version of events. But there wouldn't be many left willing to take his side. He would try to salvage his reputation, but the proof of his fraud was undeniable. He would be forced to sell off what little he had left, paying legal fees, trying to keep himself from drowning. And when all of that failed, when there was nothing left, he would be forced to accept the one thing he had never considered possible. He had lost. Catherine's downfall was slower, but just as devastating. Without access to Lucas's money, she had nothing. She had spent years living in luxury, accustomed to the best of everything. Designer clothes, fine dining, weekend getaways to the Hamptons. Now, all of it was slipping through her fingers. She had assumed she would walk away with half of everything, but Lucas had planned for that too. The legal agreements he had set in place ensured that she would leave the marriage with exactly what she had brought into it. And since she had never worked a day in her life, that meant nothing. She tried to play the victim, spinning stories to mutual friends, crying over martinis about how Lucas had blindsided her. But the sympathy didn't last. People had seen the truth unfold in real time. They had watched her stand beside Eric, smiling while they plotted against her husband. The people she had once considered friends were now keeping their distance, afraid of being associated with her mess. Lucas didn't stay to watch any of it. He had no interest in lingering in the past. Fire and Steel had survived their betrayal, but it needed a new future. Within weeks, he restructured the business, tightening financial oversight, cutting away anything that had been tainted by Eric's influence. He expanded cautiously, taking on investors he trusted, rebuilding the reputation that had nearly been destroyed. He hired new staff, brought in fresh talent, and slowly Fire and Steel became what it was always meant to be, his alone. One evening, as he stood in the restaurant's private dining area, overlooking the city skyline, he realized something. For the first time in years, he felt free, no longer tied to a toxic marriage, no longer weighed down by betrayal. He had lost something, yes, but he had also gained something invaluable: clarity. Catherine would move on, eventually. Eric would try to rebuild, but Lucas? He wasn't looking back. He had a restaurant to run, a life to reclaim, and this time it was entirely his.